February 14th, 2013. It's Valentine's Day in Metairie, Louisiana, a suburban community just outside New Orleans city limits.
Metairie is a great suburb of New Orleans. It's a smaller area that has a lot of the same amenities of New Orleans.
Metairie is New Orleans' sister, in a way. It's very friendly, warm, and inviting.
It is where people go to kind of get away from the craziness that can happen in New Orleans.
And February of 2013 was even crazier than usual.
You had Super Bowl 47 going on in New Orleans, and then you had Mardi Gras, which was on Fat Tuesday on February 12th.
Mardi Gras is like a whole different world, to be honest. There's multiple parades, multiple balls.
That incessant round of parades and parties are what brings three friends of Milan Boudreaux out to Metairie 2 days after Fat Tuesday.
Milan had been a no-show at several events that week during Mardi Gras.
Friends were concerned that they hadn't heard from her in over a week.
She wasn't answering or returning their calls either.
It was radio silence, which is completely unlike their relationship.
Something clearly is wrong. So on this particular day, they say, you know what, we're gonna go to the house.
Milan!
But there's no answer.
Maybe she went somewhere. Well, then why didn't she answer her phone?
Milan's vehicle was missing from the parking lot.
Let's try and call the apartment complex.
They contacted the property manager, and she was not available.
Then they noticed a maintenance man at the neighboring apartment, and they asked him to let them in.
When they talked to the maintenance man, he said he didn't have a key.
But he did know a way inside.
The maintenance man suggested that they try the sliding door.
So they ended up hopping the fence.
It's stuck.
There was a PVC pipe or something blocking the door.
Let me try.
They were able to jimmy it open.
What is this? Oh!
They were taken back by the smell.
Milan?
But much worse awaits them inside.
They found Milan laying on the ground in the apartment.
"26-year-old Milan Boudreaux had been living her best life.
She was someone that everyone loved. Quirky, clever, funny, just someone you want to be around all the time.
But getting there hadn't been easy.
Milan was born Morris Alexander. She had a very difficult time growing up as a transgender woman in the South. However, Milan put on a brave face. She walked with pride. She embraced who she was.
And she had a knack for bringing that confidence out in others.
Milan was a stylist. She loved to help others look good. It was her passion.
So, of course, she had all the fashion trends on lock. And she had the hair on point, nails on point, makeup on point.
She was also very active in New Orleans' club scene.
It's a place where people can freely express themselves and do not have to worry about judgment and ridicule for their personal beliefs and their sexual orientation.
She loved the New Orleans nightlife and had a very close-knit friendship group.
However, Milan's life wasn't all play.
She was taking classes at Southern University in New Orleans.
And through it all, she had the loving support of her longtime friend, Akeem.
Akeem and Milan were best friends.
They'd grown up together in New Orleans in this tight-knit group of friends, but the two were like night and day.
Milan was the girl's girl, the fashionista, but Akeem was a guy's guy. He was on the football team, he loved his sports.
They were polar opposite.
But eventually, those opposites did attract.
You sure about this?
What do you mean? You know. Come on, Malone. It's me.
Despite what society may have said or the pressures they may have felt, Akeem didn't have a problem with it.
Akeem was not embarrassed about his relationship with Milan. He was very, very, very proud of who she was and who they were.
He loved her, appreciated her, and wanted to be with her. So it was natural that they came together to become a couple.
Once they were official, Milan moved into Akeem's apartment in suburban Metairie.
Akeem was actually the one who suggested that Milan move in with him. And Milan even went as far as taking Akeem's last name because she felt so secure in their relationship.
Although it wasn't yet legal, they essentially considered themselves married.
This relationship was on its way to a bright future.
But now, after being unable to reach Milan for more than a week, friends have found her dead body inside her and Akeem's suburban New Orleans home.
Milan's friend, Celeste, she calls 911, and the audio of that call, it is heartbreaking.
She's been missing for about a week. Ever since the beginning of this week, so a group of us decided to come over here and sit in there dead. Let me get somebody over here.
Jefferson Parish Sheriff's deputies respond to the scene.
All right, we're gonna need y'all to wait outside.
The person was deceased inside, so it's considered a code 2 call. Officers are basically on deck. We go in, we see what we have, we clear the house, make sure nobody else is inside.
But as the deputies move through the apartment, they make another gruesome discovery.
Hey, back here.
They find another dead body.
After spending most of her life struggling with discrimination over her identity, Milan Boudreau had found love with her best friend, Akeem.
Milan and Akeem established a relationship.
People like seeing them together, and his family says that he was happy.
They were a very loving couple.
But now, after Milan and Akeem have been missing for over a week, Jefferson Parish Sheriff's deputies have discovered 2 dead bodies inside the couple's suburban New Orleans apartment.
They knew that they had been there for quite some time because of how badly decomposed they were.
They were almost unidentifiable. They were so decomposed.
Start major crime.
So you can just imagine how terrible that scene must have been.
After deputies secure the scene, homicide detectives arrive to begin their investigation.
They were trying to determine what went wrong in this apartment.
There's speculation as to what occurred. Is it a murder-suicide? Is it a home invasion?
Based on the condition of the apartment, a home invasion appears unlikely.
There were no signs of forced entry.
They were also able to rule out that this was a robbery.
No large ticket items were missing.
However, neither victim had a cell phone on them.
And while the detectives suspect the victims are Milan and Akeem, what happened inside the apartment is less clear.
Due to how badly the bodies were decomposed, they were unable to tell on scene exactly the cause of death.
Although there are some clues.
There was a .380 shell casing found at the scene.
And there was no gun found anywhere in the apartment.
Detectives were able to rule out a murder-suicide.
Jefferson Parish are now investigating this as a double homicide.
While the medical examiner's crew removes the bodies in order to confirm their identities and determine exactly how they died, detectives speak with Milan and Akeem's friends, Scott and Brandon.
Milan's friend Celeste was too distraught to give her statement at the scene.
She was devastated. This woman was looking for her friend and then found her in this state.
The detectives begin by trying to establish a timeline to determine when the murders occurred.
The state of these bodies, they were so badly decomposed, told them it had been quite a while.
When was the last time you saw Milan?
Monday night at a club.
About what time?
About 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning.
That would be the early morning hours of February 5th. So that was 9 days before the bodies were discovered.
All right, why did you go over there today?
I called several times and several other friends called also. Everyone was getting word.
Both Milan and Akeem were very active in their friend groups and their communities. This wasn't like them to just disappear.
In fact, Scott says he'd been so worried he'd dropped by the apartment on Monday.
And that was the 11th, 3 days before they found the bodies.
I didn't knock on the door because I didn't see a car.
He thought, okay, maybe they're out of town.
When people go missing, there are lots of different possibilities of why they went missing, whether they just want to get away from life stress, their environment.
But after several more days with no word from Milan, Scott, Celeste, and Brandon had decided to try again.
They had a very strong feeling that something was wrong.
But when they got there, her car was still gone.
Maybe she went somewhere.
They got no answer on the door.
The front door was locked, and that's when we sat out. I talked to the manager.
That didn't work. So when the maintenance man suggested that they try the sliding door, they did not hesitate.
We said, let's do it, because we both worried. Like, we don't go a day without really talking to her.
But Scott is still in shock from the horrific scene they encountered inside the apartment.
The friends can't believe what happened. They have no reason to think their friends would be dead like this.
Any idea who would have dug them home?
No, ma'am.
This was a couple who didn't appear to have any enemies.
Thank you for your
And the crime scene has left detectives little to work with.
They had one shell casing, that was it.
However, what's missing from the scene may be just as important for the investigation.
Their car was not in the parking lot.
Where could this vehicle be?
Maybe the killer had made off with Milan and Akeem's car.
Hoping it could lead them to the killer, detectives issue a be on the lookout for the vehicle.
At this point, detectives were grasping at straws.
Although when detectives receive the autopsy results, they do at least confirm that the victims are indeed Milan and Akeem.
The autopsy also confirmed how they died.
Milan and Akeem both suffered with gunshot wounds to their head.
They'd both been shot execution style.
Akeem had been shot in the side of his head. The angle of Milan's wounds suggested that she was in front of the attacker when she was shot.
But who would want to execute the couple? With little else to go on, the detectives start digging into Milan and Akeem's past.
They wanted to know who are these people affiliated with and what would lead to this crime.
It was possible that only one of them was the killer's target and the other was just collateral damage.
When the detectives run Akeem's name through their database, something pops.
Akeem was on probation for a marijuana charge.
Are they looking at a drug deal gone bad?
Or was it possible Milan was the target?
Looking into her background, the detectives discovered that Milan had been on probation, but it was not for selling drugs. It was for selling herself.
Detectives investigating the deaths of Milan and Akeem Boudreaux have uncovered information that may have contributed to the couple's execution-style murders.
Akeem was on probation for a marijuana charge, and Milan was a sex worker.
Milan was arrested 8 months prior for prostitution, and she was also on probation.
And now detectives wonder if either could have been a factor in the murders.
Are they looking at someone who was upset about a drug deal?
Or was the killer one of Milan's clients?
Sex work is a very dangerous line of work because those who do sex work are less likely to report sexual harassment, assault, and stalking.
You can imagine for detectives that the sky is the limit here.
Hoping to learn more about the couple's illegal activities, the detectives reach out to more people in Milan and Akeem's circle of friends.
Their friends admit that Akeem had been selling weed on a small scale.
They needed money to support their living.
Friends say that Milan had turned to sex work for much of the same reason.
Trans women are likely to experience hiring or workplace discrimination. This can make it extremely difficult to get a job and keep a job.
And since Milan was also paying for school, the money she made at the salon wasn't always enough.
Many trans women are forced to do sex work because they have no other way of making a living.
Milan would meet up with gentlemen from Backpage.
Backpage was a classified advertising website that was shut down in 2018 by the Justice Department for facilitating prostitution.
It might have not been the ideal thing to do, but they were young, in love, and they needed money.
And in light of the inherent danger of sex work, friends say the couple took precautions.
That's him.
All right. I'll be in the bedroom. Be careful.
For her safety, the arrangement between Akeem and Milan was to take these appointments at their home.
But now detectives wonder if those precautions had led to a double homicide.
Now, if the killer was a client, that would explain why Milan was killed in the hallway and Akeem was killed in the bedroom.
Hoping the mystery client may have contacted Milan to schedule the appointment, the detectives subpoena her cell phone records.
That might also explain why her phone was missing. The killer might have taken it, thinking that their number would show up in the call or text logs.
Then, while waiting for the phone records, detectives receive a call from Milan's mother.
Homicide.
After the police released the crime scene, she and Akeem's family started cleaning out the apartment.
Yeah, we were cleaning out their things and I noticed something.
Milan's mom realizes her laptop is missing.
It wasn't on the list that you gave us.
Did you guys take it into
Evidence?
No, ma'am.
So now there's no car, there's no cell phone, there's no laptop.
Detectives assume the killer took it for the same reason they may have taken her phone.
Since Milan was advertising via an internet site, the computer may contain information leading to the killer.
But when they receive Milan's phone records, they don't get detectives any closer to identifying a suspect.
The calls and texts Milan made prior to her death were only to her friends and family. So she must have been using email or a texting app to talk to clients.
With her phone a dead end, the detectives focus on Milan's missing car.
Detective, can you come look at this?
They pulled traffic footage from the area around Milan's apartment, and they see Milan's car.
On the video, it appears to be traveling away from the apartment.
The timestamp was February 5th at 9 p.m.
The detectives are convinced that the killer had made off with Milan and Akeem's car.
But if detectives can find it, will it lead them to Milan and Akeem's killer? On February 16th, 2 days after friends found Milan and Akeem's dead bodies inside their apartment, police in Baton Rouge respond to a domestic disturbance call.
Baton Rouge is about 80 miles outside of New Orleans.
Get in the car. Get in the car.
They were called out to a domestic violence altercation in the middle of the street.
When the police arrive, they find a man beating a woman outside a car that stopped in the street.
Once he realizes the police are there, The man tries to make a run for it.
Hey, stop.
No. He doesn't get very far. Police catch him.
The man's name is Melvin Miller.
The woman he was assaulting was his girlfriend, Sienna Hampton.
Put your hands behind your back.
But will an assault charge be the only thing Melvin's facing?
When the police run his tags, they find something really suspicious.
He was driving a dead woman's car.
Two days after friends found Milan and Akeem Boudreaux's dead bodies inside the couple's suburban New Orleans apartment, there may be a breakthrough in the case.
Police in Baton Rouge have reached out to Jefferson Parish, letting them know they have a man in custody who has possession of Milan's vehicle. Thank you.
They found the car. We gotta go.
Jefferson Parish detectives immediately make the hour-and-a-half drive to Baton Rouge.
Time now is 4:20 a.m. I'm speaking with Mr. Melvin Miller.
They have questions for this man. They want to know why a man in Baton Rouge is driving Milan's car.
But when they ask him how he ended up with Milan's car, Melvin says he had no idea it was stolen.
Melvin stated that he had bought the vehicle off a gentleman at a gas station on Plank Road in Baton Rouge.
There was a for sale sign in it?
Yes, ma'am.
Melvin said that while he was looking at the car, a man approached him and started negotiating the price.
He gave me how much I had, like $800. Okay.
He says he handed over the $800, and the man had simply given him the keys.
Did you get a bill of sale or anything?
No, ma'am.
The title?
No, ma'am.
In fact, Melvin said he didn't even get the man's name.
He said he seemed to be in his 20s, he had dreadlocks.
You didn't get a phone number?
No, ma'am. I ain't have no phone.
Melvin had an answer for everything.
But the detectives have their doubts.
You trust him enough to give him $800 and not get a piece of paper?
Yes.
What if he came back and said, I want my car?
Melvin claims the man selling the vehicle was not going to come back for the vehicle and it was most likely just going to be his.
He says the car was probably what's known as a rock rental.
A rock rental is you renting this car from the person that owes you drug money. So since they don't have the money for their drugs that they're getting from you, you take their car until they're able to pay you your money.
It's essentially collateral. If you don't pay up, the dealer will sell the car to recover some of the money that you owe.
Or could there be another reason the man was so eager to sell the car?
Maybe it tied him to the murder.
Still, before the detectives look into the mysterious young man with the dreadlocks, they'll need to rule out Melvin as a suspect.
You weren't in New Orleans or Jefferson Parish or that area the week after Super Bowl?
No, ma'am.
Or last week, Mardi Gras or anything?
No, ma'am.
Melvin swore that he had not been in New Orleans in weeks and that he was actually out of town the night of February 5th.
Okay, where did you go?
To Texas.
Texas?
Uh-huh.
Melvin tells detectives he'd taken a bus to Dallas.
What bus?
The Greyhound bus.
You signed the ticket?
No, ma'am.
It's at this point Melvin's alibi begins to get a little bit shaky.
You got the ticket in your name?
Mm-mm.
What name did you use to get the ticket?
Somebody else's name. I ain't want my girl to know that she don't let me leave the town. My girl, that's why.
Melvin told investigators that he was going to see another female in the Dallas area.
Okay. All right, but you didn't go to New Orleans?
No, I didn't be making noise.
Okay. And you didn't get that car in New Orleans?
No.
He started to get defensive, asking the detectives why they were so interested in his new car.
That's when detectives drop the bombshell.
The car you're in belongs to somebody's dead.
All right.
That's why you're here. That's why you're here. The person who owned the car was murdered and the car was taken.
At that point, Melvin Miller then asked for a lawyer.
You want to end the interview and get a lawyer?
Yes, ma'am.
However, while asking for an attorney allows Melvin to stop the interview, it doesn't keep him out of jail.
Investigators are able to hold him on a parole violation of possession of stolen property, which would be Milan Boudreaux's vehicle.
For the moment, they don't have enough evidence to charge him with murder.
Although when the detectives start digging into Melvin's alibi, they soon sense they're on the right track.
The first thing that investigators looked into was the woman in Dallas.
There wasn't a woman in Dallas, Texas with the name that he gave.
Canvassing the gas stations on Plank Road is also a dead end.
There is no evidence to support Melvin's story about buying the car.
Nothing was adding up.
It quickly becomes evident that Melvin Miller is not telling the truth.
However, there is still one thing missing.
Detectives hadn't been able to place Melvin anywhere near New Orleans at the time of the murder.
But will that change when the detectives receive an urgent call on February 19th?
That's 3 days after the Baton Rouge police had caught Melvin with Milan's stolen car.
Okay, why don't...
While Melvin is being held for that parole violation and the story about Akeem and Milan Boudreaux's murders are all over the news, they receive a tip from a friend of Milan's.
Milan's friend is a trans woman named Christine Harper.
She says she has important information for the detectives, so they bring her in for an interview.
My friend said that they caught a guy in Baton Rouge with Milan's car, that he's in jail. She said the guy has a tongue ring.
Christine says she knew exactly who her friend was talking about.
She said that it immediately came to my mind, the guy is Melvin Miller.
Christine told investigators that she had been talking to Melvin through Facebook, and he had expressed interest in her.
He was a guy that had a thing for trans women.
A little over 2 weeks ago, they tried to arrange a meeting.
Christine says she and Melvin never did hook up. But the date of the abortive encounter does catch the detectives' attention.
They were supposed to meet up on February 5th.
So that's Tuesday after Super Bowl.
Yes.
That's the day Milan and Akeem were murdered. And according to Christine, Melvin was in New Orleans.
He specifically told me that said he was on Canal Street.
A friend of Milan Boudreaux has just told detectives that Melvin Miller, the man detectives suspect killed the 26-year-old and her boyfriend Akeem, was in New Orleans at the time of the murders.
Christine received a message from Melvin saying that he was going to be on a Swift bus coming into town to see some friends in the New Orleans area, and he wanted to come by and hook up.
She said they mostly communicated over Facebook or KRK Messenger.
It's like a free messenger app.
Unlike regular text messages, KIK would leave no regular text messages on someone's cell records.
However, according to Christine, Melvin did call her once, on the day of the murder, to tell her he was in New Orleans.
I thought I would have to pick him up from the bus station, but he already said he was here.
Now Melvin's been caught in another lie.
Not only did he say he hadn't been to New Orleans, he also told detectives he didn't have a phone.
Yeah, did he give you the impression he was going to come over and see you?
Yes, he did.
But according to Christine, Melvin never showed.
I was like, just forget it. Yeah. Lose my number and delete.
However, while Melvin didn't hook up with Christine that Tuesday, the detectives suspect he continued looking for a good time while he was in New Orleans.
If he was looking to meet up with a trans woman, he might have had an appointment with Milan.
And it looks far more likely when the detectives show Christine a photo lineup that includes Melvin's mugshot.
Christine picks Melvin out of the lineup, saying, "That's the guy."
That's him. That's him. This one right here? Yes.
All right.
But is it enough for an arrest?
Melvin only told Christine he was in New Orleans. She never actually saw him there.
All right, thank you.
Looking for confirmation, detectives subpoena Melvin's cell phone records.
Investigators subpoenaed the cell phone records to be able to pull his geographical location.
What they find is damning.
Once the records are turned over, investigators find out that Melvin was indeed in the area on February 5th.
His phone pinged off a tower about a mile away from Milan and Akeem's apartment.
And thanks to Christine's story, detectives have a pretty good guess why he was there.
Melvin was trying to link up with Milan for a sex date.
However, while the phone records put Melvin at the scene of the crime, there is still a piece missing.
Detectives don't have a murder weapon.
Hoping to get a lead on it, the detectives head back to Baton Rouge to talk to Melvin's girlfriend, Sienna Hampton.
Sienna's the woman Melvin had been assaulting when they found him with Milan's car.
When detectives meet with her, they learn she is also transgender.
We want to start off, who is your boyfriend?
My boyfriend is Melvin Miller.
And you're in a dating type relationship?
Yeah, I guess he would be what you call a down low boy, and we have been having a down low relationship for the last 10 months.
Down low means that someone is hiding a part of themselves that they are ashamed to reveal to the rest of the world.
He tried to hide her from his friends, and he didn't like for anyone to know that he was dealing with anyone that was trans.
Sienna confirms Melvin left town on the morning of February 5th.
He wasn't supposed to be leaving Baton Rouge. That's the thing. He lied and said he was about to go by one of his friend's house, and I realized he had to took an overnight stay.
According to Sienna, Melvin was back the next day with a new car.
What did he tell you about the car? How you got a car?
Melvin advised that he got it from a friend.
His friend let Melvin drive the car back to Baton Rouge, and Melvin was supposed to bring the car back or whatever. But as days go by, Melvin continued to have the car.
Sienna also tells detectives that the car wasn't all Melvin brought back from New Orleans.
A laptop computer?
Yeah.
And an iPhone 4?
Right.
Clearly, those had to be Milan's missing phone and computer.
Where the phone and laptop are now, Sienna doesn't know.
He tried to sell it to random people in the neighborhood.
Even without the actual devices, Sienna's story strengthened the case against Melvin.
We got phone records showing that Melvin was right outside the Metairie home. We also have Melvin in possession of Milan's car, in possession of Milan's cell phone and her laptop. So law enforcement has a compelling case.
And thanks to Sienna, it's about to get even stronger.
She tells the detectives that Melvin had a gun.
He stole the gun from a friend of his.
According to Sienna, he had it with him when he went to New Orleans.
How you know?
Because he came home, he unpacked it, put it back on the shelf.
When detectives interview Melvin Miller's girlfriend, Sienna, she reveals that the 23-year-old had taken a gun to New Orleans the day someone shot and killed Milan and Akeem Boudreaux.
When he left for New Orleans, he had a gun with him?
Yeah, I realized that he had to took the gun out of the house because the gun was not at the top of the closet.
Sienna says he stores his silver handgun on the top of his closet.
But was it the murder weapon?
You know the difference between a revolver and a pistol?
Yes, I do.
Okay, was it a revolver or a pistol?
No, it's not a revolver. It's like an automatic.
Okay, is it bigger than my gun?
No, it's smaller than your gun.
While Sienna didn't know the exact caliber of the gun, her description is consistent with the murder weapon.
After talking to Sienna, The detectives secure a warrant to search the apartment she shares with Melvin.
During the search, they were unable to find any trace of a handgun, so they believe Melvin must have gotten rid of it.
Failing to find the murder weapon is a disappointment for detectives.
There was no direct evidence tying Melvin to this crime.
However, it isn't enough to stop them from charging him with murder.
Melvin is charged with second-degree murder for the killing of Milan Boudreaux and Akeem Boudreaux.
When the case goes to trial, the prosecutors argue that Melvin had gone to Milan's on the evening of February 5th looking for sex.
Prosecutors believe that this was not a premeditated crime.
If anything, murder was the last thing that Melvin had in mind.
Look way more prettier than the pictures. Aren't you funny?
Prosecutors theorized that Melvin assumed he would be alone with Milan.
But he soon realized that wasn't the case.
Sorry, I'll give y'all some space.
Who's that?
Melvin had no reason to know that Akeem would be there.
Oh, that's my boyfriend. He's cool with it.
No, I'm not cool with that.
Melvin was shocked to see that Akeem was there and got upset.
According to Sienna, Melvin's attraction to trans women was a deep secret.
I'm not cool with that.
One he would do anything to protect.
I'm not cool. Oh my God.
He ended up shooting Milan Boudreaux first. And then he went on and killed Akeem Boudreaux in their bedroom.
Hold on, what happened?
According to the prosecution, Melvin killed Milan and Akeem to protect his secret.
Prosecutors suspect Melvin took Milan's phone and computer for the same reason.
If they've been in contact on messaging apps, that info could be on either device.
And then he took Milan's car and drove back to Baton Rouge.
He was still driving the car almost 2 weeks after the murder.
When it's the defense's turn, they argue that there's a perfectly innocent explanation for why Melvin had Milan's car.
The defense stands by Melvin's original story that he bought the car from a man with dreadlocks at a gas station in Baton Rouge, and that he was the actual killer, not Melvin.
We had no witnesses saying that Melvin committed these crimes. We had no video evidence to show that Melvin went in the house. It was purely circumstantial.
But will that be enough to raise reasonable doubt with the jury?
The jurors find Melvin guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder.
He's sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Not that any amount of time can make up for everything Melvin destroyed in his moment of panic.
Milan and Akeem lost their lives, mainly because Melvin didn't want to express his true identity, or he didn't want people to know what his sexual preference was.
Marginalization, systemic oppression, hate crimes, all of these things matter because it trickles down to the individual person or the individual people.
It's a shame that Melvin couldn't live his truth, and because of that, he took the lives of 2 people who did live their truth.
It's just a horrible thing that this was a gruesome murder of 2 people in love.
The city of Chicago has a way of remembering its dead. Not through monuments or polished narratives, but through fragments, police reports filed in the early hours of the morning, yellow tape fluttering in winter wind, and stories that refuse to settle into anything clean or complete. Some cases are clear in their brutality, others dissolve into rumor and reconstruction. And then there are the ones that linger in between, half-realized in public memory, stitched together from multiple tragedies until they begin to resemble something larger, darker, and more unified than they ever truly were. This is one of those stories. It is not a single case, not a single killer, not a single moment frozen in time. But over the years, the phrase began to circulate in forums, in late-night discussions, in fragmented true crime archives, Dahlia-like Chicago dismemberment cases. A name that was never official, never recognized by law enforcement, yet powerful enough to suggest something coherent beneath the chaos. Something systematic. Something almost artistic in its violence, as though the city itself had produced its own version of a legend that refused to die. To understand why this phrase exists at all, you have to go back, not just to Chicago, but to Los Angeles in 1947. A young woman named Elizabeth Short was found brutally murdered, her body severed and displayed in a way that stunned even seasoned investigators. The press gave her a name that would outlive her, the Black Dahlia. What made the case unforgettable was not only the violence itself, but the presentation. The body was not simply discarded, it was arranged. Controlled. Almost staged. It suggested intention beyond rage, beyond impulse. It suggested a mind that wanted to be seen. That idea, the idea of violence as message, would echo across decades of true crime culture. And in Chicago, a city already burdened with industrial shadows, political corruption, and cycles of urban violence, it would find fertile ground in public imagination. Because Chicago has always had its own kind of darkness. Not the singular, cinematic kind that belongs to one infamous case, but a scattered constellation of tragedies that never quite connect, yet feel like they might if you stare long enough. Over the decades, the city has seen murders that defy easy categorization. Some were domestic in origin, born inside cramped apartments where arguments escalated into irreversible violence. Others were opportunistic, crimes of convenience followed by desperate attempts to erase evidence. In a number of cases, the aftermath included dismemberment, not as performance, but as concealment. Bodies cut apart not to send a message, but to make one disappear. And yet, when these cases are viewed through the lens of distance and time, something changes. The details begin to echo each other in unsettling ways. A suitcase abandoned near water. A torso discovered without context. A victim reduced to fragments scattered across neighborhoods that rarely overlap in lived experience. Each case, individually, tells a story of panic, of rage, of concealment. Together, they begin to feel like a pattern even when none exists. This is where myth begins to form. Among the most frequently referenced examples is a series of crimes from the early 1980s involving a group later known as the Chicago Ripper Crew. Unlike many of the city's isolated domestic tragedies, these crimes carried a different weight. They were prolonged, repetitive, and disturbingly methodical. Victims were targeted, abducted, and subjected to prolonged violence. The brutality escalated over time, leaving behind a trail of fear that spread far beyond the immediate investigation. For many who later encountered summaries of Chicago's violent history, this case became a reference point, a moment when the city seemed to confront something more organized, more intentional in its cruelty. Yet even here, the truth resists simplification. While the crimes were undeniably horrific, they did not form part of a broader continuum of similar acts across decades. They were contained within their own time, their own perpetrators, their own psychological universe. But human memory rarely respects such boundaries. As the years progressed, other cases surfaced. In the 2000s and 2010s, reports occasionally emerged of victims found in pieces, their remains concealed in luggage, plastic containers, or submerged in waterways that cut through the city like veins. Each incident was investigated independently. Each had its own suspect, its own motive, its own tragic origin. Some were acts of intimate violence that escalated beyond recognition. Others were attempts to delay discovery long enough to escape consequence. What tied them together was not evidence, but interpretation. The human mind, when confronted with repeated forms of violence, begins to seek structure. It prefers narrative over randomness. And so, across online spaces and informal discussions, these separate tragedies began to merge into something resembling a hidden continuity. A question started to emerge quietly, then more insistently: could there be something connecting them? Law enforcement consistently answered no. Not in the sense of dismissiveness, but in the sense of evidence. The forensic distinctions were too significant. The timelines too scattered. The behavioral signatures too inconsistent. One case pointed toward domestic escalation, another toward opportunistic concealment, another toward unrelated perpetrators acting under entirely different psychological pressures. There was no single trajectory, no unifying methodology, no hidden architect behind the violence. And yet, the idea persisted. Part of its persistence came from another strand of Chicago's crime history, the so-called Chicago Strangler hypothesis, which suggested the possibility of a serial offender or multiple offenders responsible for a cluster of strangulation deaths over a period of years. Unlike the dismemberment cases that fueled darker speculation, these incidents were defined by suffocation rather than post-mortem mutilation. Still, in public perception, they became entangled with broader fears about unseen patterns in urban violence. The result was a conceptual overlap. Strangulation, dismemberment, concealment, abandonment, each method of violence folded into the next in the imagination of those trying to make sense of the city's long and complex record of homicide. The boundaries between cases blurred, not in reality, but in interpretation. And that is how the phrase, Dahlia-like Chicago dismemberment cases, came into being. Not as a formal classification. Not as a police designation. But as a narrative shortcut for something that never actually existed as a single entity, a way to describe the unsettling recurrence of violent fragmentation in a major city over many decades. It is important to understand what that phrase does psychologically. It borrows the emotional clarity of a single infamous case, the Black Dahlia murder, and projects it onto a landscape of unrelated tragedies. It implies intention where there may be none. It suggests continuity where there is only coincidence. It transforms isolated acts of extreme violence into something resembling a hidden structure. But structures are comforting, even when they are false. They suggest that chaos can be decoded, that randomness can be mapped, that somewhere beneath the surface there is logic waiting to be uncovered. Chicago does not offer that comfort easily. Its history of violent crime is too varied, too dependent on individual circumstance, too shaped by social conditions that shift over time. Domestic disputes escalate in one decade, organized criminal violence dominates another, opportunistic crimes appear and disappear with economic cycles. Within this shifting landscape, dismemberment cases appear not as a pattern, but as an outcome, one possible endpoint among many in moments of extreme human breakdown. And yet, when the stories are retold, they begin to lose their individuality. Names fade. Dates blur. Locations collapse into a generalized map of fear. What remains is the image, a city, cold and vast, holding fragments of human tragedy that refuse to align neatly. This is where we begin our exploration, not with a single victim, not with a single killer, but with the space between them. The gap where meaning is constructed after the fact. The place where fact and narrative begin to diverge, and where the idea of a Dahlia-like pattern takes shape not in evidence, but in the human need to find it. Because before we can understand what happened in Chicago, we have to understand why so many different stories started to look like one. The first light of morning in Chicago does not arrive gently. It seeps in through glass and concrete, refracting off the steel skin of buildings that seem to absorb the sky rather than reflect it. By the time the city is fully awake, it already feels as though it has been moving for hours. Trucks hum along highways, trains cut beneath the streets, and the wind coming off Lake Michigan carries a coldness that settles into bone more than skin. This is the environment in which every story we are about to examine unfolded. Not a backdrop in the cinematic sense, but an active force, shaping movement, influencing visibility, determining how quickly something is discovered, or how long it remains hidden. Chicago is often described as a city of neighborhoods, but that description can be misleading when applied to violence. Because in reality, those neighborhoods do not form a unified emotional landscape. They are separate worlds stacked against one another, each with its own rhythms, its own economic pressures, its own patterns of life and survival. A tragedy in one part of the city does not automatically echo in another. Sometimes it barely registers beyond a few local blocks. And yet, when certain crimes occur, they seem to violate that natural containment. They spill outward in fragments, through police reports, through brief news mentions, through whispered retellings that lose detail with each repetition. Over time, these fragments begin to travel farther than the events themselves ever did. To understand why the idea of Dahlia-like dismemberment cases gain traction in public imagination, we need to understand how Chicago processes its violence, not as a single narrative, but as a constant accumulation of unrelated endings. In many cases across decades, the first pattern is not brutality but intimacy. A significant portion of homicides that later involved dismemberment began in ordinary domestic spaces. Apartments with thin walls, shared kitchens, the sound of television leaking through hallways. Arguments that escalate slowly, not explosively, until something irreparable happens in a moment that often feels, to those involved, both sudden and inevitable. What follows in such cases is not premeditated theatrical violence, but panic. The realization that what has occurred cannot be undone, only managed. And in that management, some individuals turn to acts that later appear monstrous in hindsight. The dismemberment of a body, in these contexts, is rarely about symbolism. It is about logistics. A desperate attempt to reduce weight, to simplify transport, to delay discovery long enough to escape the immediate consequences. But to an outside observer, especially one encountering only the aftermath, the distinction between concealment and intention can blur easily. A body in pieces does not explain its own fragmentation. It invites interpretation. It demands narrative. This is where perception begins to diverge from reality. In Chicago's long record of violent crime, there are also cases that resist even this framework of domestic escalation. Some incidents involve offenders who appear detached from their victims, where the violence is not born from relationship, but from opportunity. These are crimes shaped by proximity and circumstance, moments where vulnerability and access intersect in ways that produce irreversible outcomes. In such cases, dismemberment again appears, but with a different emotional tone. Less panic, more calculation. Not necessarily sophistication, but a cold practicality. The removal of identifying features, the separation of remains, the dispersal of evidence across locations chosen not for symbolism, but for convenience. Rivers, alleys, abandoned structures, spaces where disappearance feels plausible rather than guaranteed. Over time, investigators learn to read these distinctions. To them, the difference between emotional overreaction and logistical concealment is not abstract philosophy, but forensic necessity. Tool marks, cut patterns, timing of decomposition, spatial distribution of remains, each detail becomes a clue to intent, even when intent itself cannot be directly observed. But the public does not see this layered analysis. The public sees outcomes. And outcomes, when stripped of context, begin to resemble one another. In the early 1980s, when the crimes attributed to what would later be called the Chicago Ripper crew came to light, the city experienced a different kind of fear. This was not the fear of isolated domestic tragedy or opportunistic violence. It was the fear of repetition. The sense that something was happening more than once, in a pattern that could not be easily explained away as coincidence. The details that emerged from those investigations were disturbing not only because of their brutality, but because of their continuity. Multiple victims, similar circumstances, recurring methods. The idea that violence could be iterative, that it could evolve over time within the same behavioral framework, introduced a new psychological dimension to how the city understood danger. But even in that case, where repetition was real and demonstrable, the boundaries remained contained within a specific group of perpetrators and a specific period of time. It did not extend backward into earlier decades, or forward into later ones as part of a continuous thread. It was a chapter, not a continuum. Still, for those looking back across Chicago's broader history of violent crime, that chapter becomes a reference point. A lens through which other, unrelated events begin to be viewed. Fast forward into the early 21st century, and the pattern becomes even more diffuse. The city continues to record homicides that involve post-mortem concealment, including occasional cases of dismemberment. But each case emerges from its own private origin point. A relationship that deteriorated into violence. A dispute that escalated beyond control. A moment of opportunism that ended in irreversible consequence. The forensic reports differ as much as the human stories behind them. Different weapons, different environments, different timelines between death and discovery. In one case, remains are discovered quickly due to proximity to public space. In another, they are found only after significant decomposition alters the physical evidence. In yet another, parts are recovered separately, requiring investigators to reconstruct not only identity but sequence. And yet, when these cases are retold outside official contexts, they often lose their specificity. They become another dismemberment case, another body found in pieces, another victim in Chicago. Language simplifies what investigation complicates. This simplification is not malicious. It is structural. Human cognition is not designed to hold dozens of unrelated tragedies in parallel, without attempting to compress them into something manageable. And so patterns are perceived even when none exist. This is the psychological soil in which the phrase, Dahlia-like Chicago dismemberment cases took root. It does not describe a real investigative category. It describes an emotional synthesis, the merging of aesthetic memory from one famous case with the fragmented reality of many unrelated ones. The Black Dahlia case itself plays a crucial role in this process. Because it introduced a specific visual grammar of violence into public consciousness, the idea of the body as message, the idea of arrangement, of presentation, of intentional display. Even though most dismemberment cases in Chicago lack any such performative element, the association persists, because the mind reaches for familiar templates when confronted with incomprehensible outcomes. When a body is found in pieces, the imagination unconsciously asks whether it was meant to be seen that way. Whether there is meaning embedded in the arrangement. Whether someone was speaking through the violence. In reality, investigators repeatedly find the opposite. Not meaning, but erasure. Not communication, but concealment. As we move deeper into this exploration, it becomes essential to hold that distinction firmly in place. Because the temptation to unify these cases into a single hidden narrative is strong, and it is reinforced by decades of cultural storytelling about serial killers, hidden patterns, and urban mythologies. But Chicago's reality resists that unification. It is not a single story of one kind of violence repeating itself. It is a multitude of stories, each ending in its own rupture, each leaving behind its own kind of silence. And it is within that silence that the illusion of connection begins to form. The victim is always the center of a crime, even when the world around that crime tries to turn them into something else. A statistic. A headline. A blurred image on a news broadcast that fades into the next story, before the family has even finished processing what has happened. But in every case of extreme violence, especially those involving fragmentation of the body, the person at the center is not an abstraction. They are a life that existed in full detail long before it was reduced to fragments of a police report. In Chicago's long and uneven history of violent crime, this truth is often obscured by repetition. When cases accumulate over decades, when similar methods appear in unrelated investigations, the human element begins to dissolve under the weight of pattern seeking. People start to talk about types of cases instead of individuals. They speak of methods rather than lives. And in doing so, the victim is quietly pushed to the margins of their own story. But every one of these cases begins somewhere far more ordinary than the violence that ends them. A street corner where someone was last seen waiting for a bus that never came. A small apartment where lights were turned off in the middle of a normal evening. A phone call that ended without warning. These are not cinematic beginnings. They are fragments of routine life that later become significant only because of what followed. In the domestic cases that make up a large portion of Chicago's dismemberment-related homicides, the victims were often people embedded in familiar, tightly woven social environments. They were daughters, partners, siblings, co-workers. Their lives were shaped by the same pressures that define urban existence everywhere: financial strain, emotional conflict, unstable relationships, moments of hope interrupted by moments of exhaustion. There is a dangerous misconception that victims of violent crime exist in some separate category of life, as if their circumstances were already marked by inevitability. In reality, many of them were engaged in the same slow, unpredictable negotiation with everyday survival as anyone else in the city. They made plans for the next week, considered changing jobs, argued about small things that felt large in the moment. Nothing in their daily routines pointed toward the kind of ending that would later define how they are remembered. In some cases, friends and family describe subtle changes in hindsight. A withdrawal from social contact. A shift in tone during conversations. A sense of discomfort that only becomes meaningful after the fact. But these observations are always reconstructed through grief, shaped by the need to find meaning in what could not be prevented. At the time, these signals are rarely interpreted as warnings of imminent danger. They are simply variations in human behavior, too ambiguous to carry the weight they are later given. The violence that interrupts these lives does not arrive with clarity. It arrives as escalation. Arguments that begin over small misunderstandings can grow in intensity without visible thresholds. In confined living spaces, tension has nowhere to dissipate. It accumulates in silence, in tone, in the timing of words that are said too sharply or not at all. When these moments turn irreversible, it is often not because of a single decision, but because of a sequence of moments that collectively remove every alternative. In the aftermath, investigators often reconstruct these sequences with clinical precision. They map timelines, identify last known contacts, establish patterns of movement. But what these reconstructions cannot fully capture is the emotional density of the final hours before violence occurs. The uncertainty, the misinterpretations, the small decisions that seem insignificant until they are viewed through the lens of what followed. When dismemberment enters the narrative of a case, the victim's story is often overshadowed by the method of disposal. The physical fragmentation of the body becomes the defining feature in public memory, even though it occurs after death. This shift in focus is subtle but profound. The person is no longer remembered primarily for how they lived or even how they died, but for what was done to their remains. This is where distortion begins to take hold in broader cultural understanding. Because once a victim becomes associated with fragmentation, their identity is often reframed through the imagery of that violence. The details of their life recede. Their personality, their relationships, their routines are replaced in public discourse by the mechanics of their death. In the process, the victim becomes less a person and more a symbol of the crime itself. In Chicago, where multiple unrelated cases over decades have involved post-mortem dismemberment, this distortion becomes even more pronounced. The repetition of similar forensic outcomes across different investigations creates an illusion of continuity. But continuity belongs to narrative, not to reality. Each victim existed in a separate emotional and social universe, disconnected from the others except through the coincidence of geography and the shared tragedy of violence. It is important to understand that for investigators, each victim represents a distinct case file, a distinct timeline, and a distinct set of circumstances. There is no shared emotional thread between them, no hidden continuity that links their lives before the moment of death. What links them in public imagination is not evidence, but pattern recognition imposed after the fact. Family members, however, experience none of this abstraction. For them, the victim does not become part of a category. They remain specific, irreplaceable, and fully present in memory. The sound of their voice, the way they moved through a room, the small habits that defined their presence in daily life, these details do not dissolve with time in the way public narratives do. They remain fixed, unchanged by the passage of years, or the emergence of other cases. In many accounts from relatives of victims in violent crimes, there is a recurring sense of disbelief not at the violence itself, but at the transformation of the person into something unrecognizable in public discourse. The individual they knew becomes associated with images and descriptions that feel distant from lived reality. The human being is replaced by the circumstances of their death, as if those circumstances were the entirety of their existence. This tension between lived memory and public narrative is especially sharp in cases involving dismemberment. Because the physical condition of the remains often dominates early reporting, even when later forensic clarification shifts the understanding of the case. The initial shock leaves a lasting imprint that is difficult to erase, even when the investigative context becomes more precise. Yet behind every one of these cases, there is always a life that extended far beyond its final moment. A person who experienced ordinary mornings, who navigated relationships that were complex, imperfect, and evolving, who carried expectations, disappointments, and quiet ambitions that never reached resolution. These elements are not incidental to the story. They are the story itself, existing long before the violence that later defines how the case is remembered. As we move forward in this narrative, it becomes necessary to hold two realities at once. The reality of the forensic investigation, which reconstructs events with precision and detachment, and the reality of the victim's life, which cannot be fully reconstructed, but must be acknowledged in its absence. Because without that acknowledgement, the story risks becoming something else entirely. Not an account of human tragedy, but a structure built around the absence of humanity. And that is where misunderstanding begins. The moment of violence is often imagined as a singular rupture, a clean break between what came before and what comes after. But in reality, especially in cases that later become associated with dismemberment or extreme post-mortem concealment, the incident is rarely experienced as a single point in time. It is a sequence of collapsing decisions, emotional thresholds crossed without full awareness, and environments that gradually narrow until only one outcome feels possible. In Chicago's long record of homicide cases, the incident is not always the moment of death. It is the moment when control is lost, when escalation becomes irreversible, when a situation stops being negotiable. Sometimes that moment is loud and explosive. Other times it is disturbingly quiet, unfolding in the absence of witnesses, in spaces where sound is absorbed by walls and distance. To understand these incidents, one must resist the temptation to view them as isolated acts of brutality detached from context. Each one begins in a specific environment, shaped by social pressure, personal history, and immediate circumstance. A small disagreement in a confined space can become magnified by alcohol, fatigue, or long-standing resentment. A chance encounter can shift into confrontation when vulnerability and proximity intersect. Even financial stress, or emotional instability can create conditions where judgment becomes distorted, where consequences are no longer fully processed in real time. In many of the cases that later involve dismemberment, the act itself does not occur as a planned centerpiece of violence. It emerges afterward, in the aftermath of something already catastrophic. The critical turning point is not always the killing itself, but what follows it. Panic replaces intention. The mind, confronted with the reality of irreversible harm, shifts into survival mode. And survival, in these moments, is often defined in purely practical terms: how to avoid detection, how to delay discovery, how to reduce the physical evidence of what has occurred. This is where the incident transforms. Not into something theatrical, but into something procedural. The body becomes a problem to be solved rather than a person to be acknowledged. That psychological shift is difficult to comprehend from the outside, but within the logic of panic, it can happen with unsettling speed. The emotional identity of the victim does not disappear in a moral sense, but it is temporarily overridden by the urgency of consequence management. Chicago's geography plays a silent, but significant role in these incidents. The city is dense, layered, full of transitional spaces where movement is constant and anonymity is possible. Apartment buildings with shared hallways, alleyways that cut between streets like hidden corridors, industrial zones that fall into silence after working hours, and waterways that carry both commerce and concealment. These environments do not cause violence, but they shape its aftermath. They determine how quickly something is noticed, how easily something can be hidden, how far evidence can travel before it is recovered. In incidents involving dismemberment, the physical act of separation is often driven by constraints rather than symbolism. Space limitations, transportation difficulties, time pressure, and fear of immediate discovery all contribute to decisions that, from an outside perspective, appear incomprehensible. But within the narrow psychological frame of the perpetrator in that moment, each action is evaluated not for meaning, but for utility. What reduces risk? What delays exposure? What creates distance between the act and its consequences? It is important to emphasize that these incidents vary widely in their structure. There is no single behavioral pattern that defines them across decades. Some occur within intimate relationships that have deteriorated over time, where familiarity becomes the backdrop for escalating conflict. Others occur between individuals with minimal prior connection, where the violence is sudden and situational. Still others arise from opportunistic circumstances, where vulnerability is exploited in a brief window of opportunity. Despite this diversity, the aftermath often produces similar investigative challenges. The fragmentation of remains complicates identification, sequence reconstruction, and timeline establishment. Investigators must work backward from incomplete physical evidence, reconstructing events through forensic markers that can only partially capture the lived reality of what occurred. Each piece of evidence becomes a fragment of a larger sequence that must be inferred rather than directly observed. At the scene itself, what is immediately visible is often disorienting. The absence of context forces interpretation. A location that would otherwise be ordinary, a residential interior, a stretch of riverbank, an abandoned structure, becomes charged with meaning after discovery. But that meaning is retrospective. At the moment of the incident, there is no narrative clarity. There is only action, consequence, and the immediate attempt to manage what follows. For those who arrive after the fact, the emotional impact is shaped by this disconnect. First responders encounter situations where the ordinary structure of environment has been disrupted in ways that resist quick categorization. The human mind instinctively seeks order, even in chaos, but these scenes often offer no immediate coherence. The investigation begins not with understanding, but with containment and documentation. Family members, when they are drawn into the incident phase through notification or early awareness, experience a different kind of rupture. For them, the incident is not a forensic event, but an emotional collapse of expectation. The last known moment of normalcy becomes fixed in memory, while everything that follows exists in a state of disbelief that does not easily resolve. The transition from person to victim is not abstract, it is immediate and irreversible. As these incidents accumulate across time and geography, public perception begins to compress them into categories. Words like brutal, gruesome, or fragmented begin to replace the specific circumstances of individual cases. This linguistic compression is part of how societies process repeated exposure to violence. But it also contributes to the erosion of distinction between unrelated events. In Chicago's case, this compression is particularly pronounced because of the city's size and the diversity of its homicide profiles. Incidents involving dismemberment are statistically rare relative to the total number of violent crimes, yet they attract disproportionate attention due to their visceral nature. This attention, once circulated through media and informal discussion, often strips away the contextual boundaries that separate one case from another. The result is a psychological blending of incidents that were never connected in reality. Different perpetrators, different motivations, different circumstances begin to occupy the same conceptual space. Over time, this space can take on the appearance of continuity, even when none exists. And so the incident phase, when viewed through the lens of cultural memory rather than investigative record, becomes distorted. It is no longer a series of distinct ruptures in separate lives. It becomes a generalized image of violence that appears to repeat itself with unsettling consistency. But beneath that image, the reality remains fragmented in a different sense. Each incident is anchored in its own set of conditions, its own sequence of decisions, and its own irreversible outcome. The challenge is not to find unity where there is none, but to understand how easily the human mind constructs it in the absence of complete information. As we continue into the next stages of this narrative, the focus will shift from the moment of violence itself to the space where that violence is first recognized by the outside world. Because it is in that moment of discovery that private catastrophe becomes public reality, and where interpretation begins to shape what is believed to have happened. The discovery of a homicide is never a single moment. It is a chain of perception, an accidental glance, a hesitation, a realization that something in the environment does not belong. In Chicago's long record of violent crime, many cases that later became part of broader discussions about dismemberment or extreme concealment began not with certainty, but with uncertainty. Someone notices a smell that does not fit the season. A maintenance worker finds a locked room that should not be locked. A passerby sees something in the water that the light should have hidden, but did not. At first, there is always doubt. The human mind resists the conclusion. It searches for alternative explanations, safer interpretations. What appears to be evidence of violence is initially processed as something else: discarded objects, animal remains, industrial waste, or simple misperception. This hesitation is not negligence, it is a psychological defense. The implication of a human body is too heavy to accept immediately, so the mind delays recognition until it can no longer avoid it. In urban environments like Chicago, where the sensory noise of the city is constant, this delay can be significant. The smell of exhaust, the rhythm of construction, the presence of waterways and industrial zones, all of these create conditions where anomalies can remain unnoticed longer than expected. A location that is already visually complex can hide irregularities simply by overwhelming perception. When discovery finally occurs, it is rarely clean or immediate. There is a moment of recognition that unfolds in layers. First, the suspicion. Then the confirmation that something is wrong. Then the realization that what is present is not an object, but human remains. Each stage carries its own emotional weight, and each stage alters the response of the person encountering it. Witness accounts from such moments often share a similar structure, even when the cases themselves are unrelated. There is confusion at first, followed by physical withdrawal, a step backward, a refusal to look too directly. Then comes the involuntary return of attention, as if the mind cannot fully disengage from what it has seen. In many cases, the witness reports a sense of unreality, as though the scene belongs to a different world that has briefly overlapped with their own. Emergency calls made after such discoveries carry this instability. The voice on the other end of the line is often fragmented, struggling to translate visual shock into coherent language. Descriptions are incomplete, repeated, corrected mid-sentence. Operators are trained to extract clarity from confusion, but even they must sometimes slow the exchange to allow meaning to stabilize. When first responders arrive, the space transforms again. What was previously private perception becomes structured observation. The perimeter is established. Access is controlled. The environment is documented not as a whole, but as a series of details, position, condition, surrounding objects, environmental factors. This methodical approach is necessary because the initial moment of discovery is too emotionally unstable to serve as evidence on its own. In cases involving dismemberment, the discovery phase is often more fragmented than in other homicides. The remains may not be located in a single place. Instead, they are sometimes distributed across multiple sites, each requiring its own discovery narrative. One location may yield partial remains. Another may reveal additional fragments days or weeks later. This dispersion complicates not only investigation, but also emotional processing for those involved. Each discovery point carries its own psychological impact. Finding a single part of a person without the context of the whole creates a dissonance that is difficult to resolve. The mind instinctively seeks completion, but the environment offers only partial information. Investigators must therefore reconstruct not only identity, but spatial relationships between discoveries, attempting to restore coherence where the physical evidence resists it. Chicago's geography again plays a subtle but important role. Waterways that cut through the city can carry evidence away from its origin point. Abandoned industrial structures provide spaces where discovery may be delayed. Dense residential zones create conditions where proximity does not guarantee visibility. A victim can be close to others in physical distance, yet remain effectively invisible until chance intervenes. Once a discovery is confirmed as homicide, the emotional atmosphere shifts dramatically. What was uncertainty becomes certainty, and with that shift comes a new set of responses. Curiosity gives way to shock. Shock gives way to avoidance, and avoidance eventually gives way to the slow return of routine. For the community surrounding the discovery site, life often resumes outwardly normal patterns even while awareness of the event lingers underneath. For investigators, however, the discovery is only the beginning of a longer process. Each piece of evidence collected at the scene must be interpreted within a broader framework. Time of death estimates, environmental exposure, trauma analysis, and identification procedures all begin from this initial point. The goal is not only to understand what happened, but to reconstruct a timeline that can withstand scrutiny in legal and forensic contexts. In cases where dismemberment is present, identification becomes a particularly sensitive and complex process. Physical separation of remains can delay recognition, requiring cross-referencing of biological markers, dental records, and sometimes genetic analysis. Until identification is confirmed, the victim remains legally and administratively undefined, referred to in procedural terms that temporarily suspend personal identity. This administrative suspension contrasts sharply with the emotional reality experienced by those who eventually recognize the victim. For families, the discovery phase is not a beginning, but a transition from uncertainty to irreversible knowledge. The moment of identification collapses all previous ambiguity into a single, final understanding. It is not just the confirmation of death, but the confirmation of permanence. Public perception of discovery scenes is often shaped by limited information. Early reports tend to emphasize dramatic elements while omitting the slower investigative context that follows. This creates an incomplete picture that can linger in memory long after official findings provide clarification. In the absence of full information, imagination fills the gaps, often in ways that amplify emotional impact. Over time, as multiple unrelated cases pass through similar stages of discovery, a pattern appears to emerge at the level of narrative rather than fact. People begin to associate certain types of locations, certain environmental conditions, or certain descriptions with a generalized idea of violent discovery. This association contributes to the broader mythologizing of urban violence, particularly in cities with high population density and complex crime histories like Chicago. Yet each discovery remains fundamentally specific. It occurs at a particular place, at a particular time, under particular circumstances. The similarity between cases exists not in shared origin, but in shared structure of response, confusion, recognition, confirmation, investigation. As we move forward from discovery into the next phase of investigation, the focus will shift from what is found to how meaning is constructed from what is found. Because discovery is not the end of uncertainty, it is the beginning of interpretation, where fragments of evidence begin to form the outlines of a story that has not yet been fully told. The investigation begins in the space where certainty dissolves into procedure. A crime that, in its first discovery, feels overwhelming and emotionally immediate is gradually transformed into something structured, segmented, and methodical. In Chicago's homicide investigations, especially those involving complex post-mortem concealment or dismemberment, this transition is not just administrative. It is psychological. It is the moment when chaos is forced into a system designed to contain it. At the scene, investigators move with deliberate restraint. Every motion is measured, not because the urgency is absent, but because precision is the only way to preserve meaning. The environment is no longer a place where something happened in an emotional sense. It is now a repository of evidence. The language shifts accordingly. Objects become exhibits. Locations become reference points. Time becomes a sequence to be reconstructed rather than experienced. In cases involving fragmented remains, this process becomes even more intricate. The first challenge is establishing scope. How many locations are involved? How many elements of the victim have been recovered? Whether the scene represents a single event or multiple stages of disposal. These questions cannot be answered immediately. They require accumulation of detail, comparison across sites, and careful avoidance of premature conclusions. One of the most difficult aspects of such investigations is resisting narrative temptation. When evidence appears in fragments, the human mind naturally seeks to connect them into a coherent whole. Investigators are trained to delay that impulse. A pattern assumed too early can distort interpretation of later findings. What appears connected may in fact be coincidental. What appears random may later reveal structure. The discipline of the investigation lies in holding both possibilities open without committing too soon to either. Chicago's investigative units have developed over decades a procedural resilience shaped by the city's scale and diversity of crime. No single case defines their methodology. Instead, it is the accumulation of many unrelated cases that informs their approach. Domestic homicides, opportunistic killings, gang-related violence, and rare cases of extreme concealment all contribute to a shared institutional knowledge base. Yet each new investigation still demands that knowledge be applied without assumption. In dismemberment-related cases, forensic anthropology often becomes central to the investigative process. The condition of remains can reveal information about post-mortem handling, environmental exposure, and sometimes the tools used in the act of separation. But even these details are not self-explanatory. A cut mark on bone does not reveal intent. It reveals contact. Interpretation requires context, and context must be built from multiple converging lines of evidence. The timeline reconstruction is another critical component. Investigators attempt to determine when the victim was last seen alive, when death likely occurred, and when the body was first disturbed after death. Each of these intervals can shift as new evidence emerges. Surveillance footage, digital communications, witness statements, and forensic indicators are layered together in an attempt to narrow uncertainty. But in many cases, gaps remain that cannot be fully closed. Witness testimony, when available, introduces both clarity and complexity. Human memory is not a fixed record. It is influenced by stress, time, and subsequent information. In high-impact cases, witnesses may recall details with intense emotional certainty that does not always align with physical evidence. Investigators must navigate this carefully, respecting the emotional reality of testimony while verifying it against objective indicators. In cases that later become part of broader public discourse, particularly those involving unusual brutality or fragmentation, external attention begins to influence the investigative environment. Media coverage can increase pressure for resolution, introduce speculative narratives, and sometimes distort public understanding of what is actually known. Investigators must operate within this environment without allowing external interpretation to override evidentiary discipline. Within Chicago, the scale of the city adds another layer of complexity. Jurisdictional boundaries, resource allocation, and case prioritization all influence how investigations unfold. A case involving dismemberment does not exist in isolation from other active investigations. It is part of a larger system that must balance multiple urgent demands simultaneously. This reality often goes unseen in public narratives, which tend to focus on individual cases as though they exist in isolation. As evidence accumulates, suspects may begin to emerge. But the process of identification is rarely linear. Initial persons of interest are often identified through proximity, relationship, or behavioral patterns observed in the immediate aftermath of discovery. These early leads may later be confirmed, refined, or dismissed entirely as additional information becomes available. The investigative path is not a straight line, but a branching structure of possibilities that narrows over time. In some cases, false leads consume significant investigative resources before being ruled out. This is not failure, but part of the necessary structure of inquiry. Each eliminated possibility refines the understanding of what remains plausible. The absence of connection is itself information. When forensic evidence is strong, it can provide anchors that stabilize the investigation. DNA analysis, digital records, and trace evidence can link individuals to locations or actions with a high degree of confidence. However, even strong evidence requires interpretation within context. Physical presence does not always equate to culpability, and investigators must carefully distinguish between association and causation. In cases involving dismemberment, the question of intent becomes particularly significant. Whether the act was premeditated concealment or post-incident reaction can influence both investigative direction and legal interpretation. Determining this requires reconstructing not only physical events, but psychological sequences, an inherently limited task based on external traces of internal states. As the investigation progresses, patterns may begin to emerge, but these patterns are often local rather than universal. They apply to a specific case, a specific sequence of actions, and a specific set of circumstances. The danger in broader interpretation lies in extending these patterns beyond their evidentiary boundaries. This is how unrelated cases begin to appear connected in public perception, even when no investigative link exists. Chicago's long history of violent crime contributes to this effect. The repetition of certain types of outcomes across decades creates a backdrop against which new cases are interpreted. But repetition of outcome does not imply repetition of cause. Two cases that end in similar physical results may originate from entirely different psychological, social, and situational conditions. Investigators are acutely aware of this distinction. Their work depends on maintaining separation between surface similarity and underlying difference. A fragmented body does not automatically indicate a common method. A concealed location does not automatically indicate a common motive. Each element must be verified within its own investigative framework. As suspects are either confirmed or eliminated, the investigative focus narrows. Evidence is consolidated, timelines are refined, and narratives are constructed that must ultimately withstand legal scrutiny. But even at this stage, certainty is rarely absolute. Investigations conclude not when every question is answered, but when sufficient evidence exists to support a legally sustainable conclusion. Outside the investigative structure, however, the story often continues in a different form. Public interpretation does not always follow evidentiary resolution. Cases that involve particularly disturbing details may remain culturally active long after official closure. They become part of a broader narrative landscape, in which individual facts are less important than emotional resonance. It is within this gap between investigation and interpretation that broader myths begin to form. Separate cases, each resolved on their own terms, begin to appear as part of a larger unseen pattern. But within the investigative record, no such pattern exists. There are only individual cases, each bound to its own specific truth. As we move forward, the next phase will bring legal process into focus, where investigative findings are tested within the structure of the courtroom. It is there that evidence must transform once again, from reconstruction to argument, and where the meaning of everything uncovered will be formally challenged, defended, and ultimately decided. The breakthrough in any complex homicide investigation rarely arrives as a single dramatic revelation. It is almost always quieter than that. It emerges gradually, built from accumulated fragments of information that, at first, seem unrelated or insignificant. Only when placed together with enough precision do they begin to form a structure that changes the direction of everything that came before. In Chicago's most intricate cases, particularly those involving fragmentation of remains or extended concealment, breakthroughs are less like sudden flashes of insight and more like shifts in gravity. The entire investigative field begins to tilt toward a new interpretation of events, and what once seemed uncertain begins to stabilize into something actionable. But even then, certainty is not immediate. It must be tested, verified, and repeatedly challenged before it can be accepted as reliable. Often, the first sign of a breakthrough is not a confession or a definitive piece of evidence, but a contradiction. A detail that does not align with the established timeline. A witness statement that suddenly gains credibility through independent corroboration. A forensic result that does not match the expected pattern. These inconsistencies accumulate until the original framework of the case can no longer contain them. In dismemberment-related investigations, breakthroughs frequently originate in forensic re-examination. Evidence that was initially catalogued and set aside may be revisited with new technology or under a revised hypothesis. A previously ambiguous trace becomes significant when compared against a newly identified suspect or location. In some cases, it is not new evidence that changes the direction of the investigation, but a new way of interpreting what has already been collected. Chicago's forensic infrastructure plays a crucial role in enabling these shifts. Over time, advancements in DNA analysis, digital reconstruction, and geolocation tracking have transformed how cold or complex cases are approached. What once required speculative reconstruction can now be supported by measurable data. But even with these tools, interpretation remains central. Data does not speak on its own. It must be arranged into meaning. A breakthrough may also come through behavioral reconstruction. Investigators often work with specialists who attempt to model the likely psychological and situational conditions surrounding the crime. These models are not definitive explanations, but structured hypotheses that help narrow investigative focus. When a behavioral profile aligns unexpectedly well with existing suspects or evidence, it can redirect the entire course of the investigation. In some cases, the breakthrough emerges from something as simple as proximity. A location previously considered irrelevant may gain significance when connected to digital records, transit data, or witness recollection. A person previously viewed as peripheral may become central when their movements are re-examined in light of new information. The investigative process is constantly resorting relevance, and breakthroughs often occur when that sorting reveals a pattern that was previously invisible. There is also the human element, which remains essential despite technological advancement. Interviews conducted long after the initial discovery sometimes yield new details when witnesses feel safer, more reflective, or more willing to revisit traumatic memory. Small inconsistencies in earlier statements may resolve into coherent explanations when re-examined under less immediate pressure. These moments can quietly alter the direction of an entire case. But perhaps the most significant aspect of any breakthrough is not the discovery itself, but the collapse of alternative explanations. Investigations often begin with multiple plausible theories. As evidence accumulates, these theories are tested against reality. The breakthrough occurs when one explanation begins to consistently account for details that others cannot. At that point, the investigation shifts from exploration to consolidation. In cases involving dismemberment, this consolidation phase is particularly sensitive. The physical nature of the evidence demands careful reconstruction of sequence and intent. Investigators must determine not only what happened, but in what order and under what conditions. The difference between actions taken in panic and actions taken with forethought can significantly alter the interpretation of the case. Chicago's investigative teams are accustomed to this level of complexity. They operate within a system that demands both patience and precision. Breakthroughs are rarely celebrated in real time. Instead, they are absorbed into the structure of the investigation, quietly redirecting effort toward a narrowing set of possibilities. What appears externally as sudden resolution is internally a gradual tightening of focus. At this stage, the suspect pool, if one exists, becomes more defined. Individuals who were once peripheral may now be evaluated with greater scrutiny. Alibis are re-examined. Digital footprints are reconstructed. Financial, relational, and geographical data are aligned to identify inconsistencies or points of convergence. The goal is no longer to explore all possibilities, but to eliminate those that cannot withstand cumulative evidence. It is important to note that breakthroughs do not always lead to immediate closure. Even when a strong suspect is identified, legal standards require a level of evidentiary rigor that can extend the investigative timeline significantly. Evidence must be admissible, verifiable, and resilient under cross-examination. This means that investigators must continue refining their case long after the direction has been determined. Public perception of breakthroughs often differs from investigative reality. In media narratives, breakthroughs are portrayed as decisive turning points that instantly resolve uncertainty. In practice, they are transitional phases that shift uncertainty into a more structured form. Questions do not disappear, they become more focused. In Chicago cases that have entered broader public awareness, especially those involving extreme violence or unusual concealment, the idea of breakthrough often becomes part of the narrative mythology surrounding the case. People assume that once a breakthrough occurs, clarity follows immediately. But investigative clarity is cumulative. It builds gradually, and even then, it may remain partial. There are also cases where what appears to be a breakthrough initially does not hold under further scrutiny. Evidence that seems decisive may later be reinterpreted. Witness accounts may change. Forensic results may be re-evaluated in light of new context. These reversals are not failures, but part of the investigative process. They reflect the evolving nature of understanding in complex cases. In dismemberment investigations, such reversals can be particularly significant because early assumptions about method or intent can strongly influence subsequent interpretation. Correcting those assumptions requires intellectual discipline and institutional willingness to adjust direction even after significant resources have been invested. As the breakthrough phase progresses, the investigation begins to transition toward legal preparation. Evidence is organized not only for understanding, but for presentation. Chain of custody is verified, documentation is finalized, and narratives are constructed in a form that can withstand judicial scrutiny. The focus shifts from discovery to articulation. But even as this transition occurs, the underlying complexity of the case remains. A breakthrough does not simplify the past. It only reorganizes it. The events themselves remain as complex and fragmented as before, but now they are arranged into a structure that allows for legal and analytical engagement. In the broader context of Chicago's history of violent crime, breakthroughs in individual cases rarely resolve public perception of broader patterns. Even when cases are solved, the memory of similarity between unrelated incidents often persists. This is where the distinction between investigative resolution and cultural interpretation becomes most visible. Investigators work within the boundaries of evidence. Public narratives often extend beyond those boundaries, linking resolved cases into larger imagined structures. But within the investigative record, each breakthrough belongs only to its own case. It does not extend outward into unrelated events. As we move forward into the next phase, the focus will shift from investigative breakthrough to legal confrontation, where evidence must be tested in adversarial conditions. It is in that space that certainty is challenged once again, not by uncertainty, but by opposition, and where the meaning of the breakthrough is ultimately defined under the structure of law. The courtroom is where an investigation changes its language. Everything that was once fluid, uncertain, and evolving is forced into structure. Evidence becomes argument. Memory becomes testimony. Interpretation becomes something constrained by rules that exist not to explore truth freely, but to determine whether a version of truth can withstand challenge. In cases involving extreme violence and dismemberment, this transition is especially stark. What investigators once handled as fragments of physical reality must now be translated into narrative form that a jury can follow without losing precision. Each piece of evidence is no longer just a clue. It is a statement being made on behalf of the past, and that statement must now survive confrontation. Chicago's courtrooms, like its investigative units, are accustomed to violent crime. But familiarity does not reduce gravity. Each trial still carries the weight of irreversible harm, and each presentation of evidence reopens emotional space that investigation had already tried to stabilize. For those closest to the case, the courtroom is not a neutral setting. It is a place where the meaning of events is actively contested. The prosecution begins by constructing a narrative framework. It is not yet argument in the adversarial sense, but organization. A sequence of events is laid out, carefully ordered, designed to guide the jury through what is known and what can be supported. Time becomes central. Movements are mapped. Interactions are reconstructed. The goal is to create continuity, where the original events were fragmented by violence and uncertainty. In dismemberment-related cases, this reconstruction faces an additional challenge. The physical condition of the evidence means that the sequence of events is not always immediately visible. What happened first must be inferred from what remains. Forensic experts are called to translate physical traces into temporal logic. The order of injuries, the timing of death, the conditions of postmortem handling, all must be explained in a way that can be understood outside scientific language. The defense, in turn, does not need to construct an alternative complete narrative. It only needs to introduce doubt where certainty is assumed. This creates a dynamic tension in the courtroom where the same evidence is viewed through different interpretive lenses. A forensic finding presented as conclusive by one side may be reframed as inconclusive by the other. A timeline presented as coherent may be shown to contain gaps that cannot be fully resolved. Witness testimony plays a central role in this process. Unlike physical evidence, testimony is shaped by perception, memory, and time. A witness may describe events with sincerity and emotional clarity, yet still provide information that is incomplete or partially inconsistent with other evidence. The courtroom must then navigate the space between lived experience and objective reconstruction. Family members of victims often sit through this process in a state of prolonged emotional tension. For them, the trial is not an abstract legal procedure. It is a structured return to the moment when everything changed. Hearing details of the case presented in formal language can create a sense of distance from the emotional reality of loss, even as it forces that reality into focus again. The courtroom becomes a place where grief and procedure overlap without fully merging. Defendants in such cases are often presented through two competing frameworks. One is legal, focused on actions, intent, and responsibility. The other is psychological, attempting to contextualize behavior through background, circumstance, or mental state. These frameworks do not always align, and the tension between them becomes part of the trial's structure. In cases involving dismemberment, the question of intent becomes especially significant. The prosecution may argue that post-mortem actions indicate consciousness of guilt and deliberate efforts to conceal evidence. The defense may counter that such actions occurred in a state of panic or impaired judgment, emphasizing the absence of premeditated intent. The jury is then tasked with interpreting behavior that exists at the intersection of emotion and consequence. Expert witnesses provide critical support for both sides. Forensic anthropologists, medical examiners, digital analysts, and behavioral specialists each contribute interpretations that must be integrated into a broader understanding of the case. Yet even expert testimony is not immune to challenge. Methodology, assumptions, and interpretation can all be scrutinized, creating a layered discourse within the courtroom that mirrors the complexity of the investigation itself. Chicago's legal system, shaped by decades of diverse and often high-profile criminal cases, has developed a procedural rhythm that balances structure with adaptability. Judges guide proceedings to ensure clarity, while attorneys work within established rules to present competing interpretations of the same underlying facts. Despite the adversarial nature of the process, there is an underlying shared commitment to procedural integrity. As evidence is presented and challenged, the jury becomes the focal point of interpretation. Unlike investigators or attorneys, jurors are not trained to navigate forensic complexity or legal nuance. Their role is to synthesize competing narratives into a conclusion that reflects their understanding of credibility, coherence, and reasonable doubt. This transformation of complex investigative material into collective judgment is one of the most demanding aspects of the judicial process. Throughout the trial, the fragmented nature of dismemberment cases remains present in both explicit and implicit ways. Explicitly, through forensic testimony and physical evidence. Implicitly, through the emotional weight carried by descriptions of how the body was discovered and reconstructed. These elements influence perception even when they are not central to legal argumentation. Closing arguments mark the final attempt by each side to consolidate interpretation. The prosecution seeks to unify evidence into a single coherent narrative of responsibility. The defense seeks to reintroduce ambiguity, emphasizing gaps, uncertainties, and alternative explanations. Both are aware that the outcome will depend not on absolute certainty, but on the threshold of doubt required by law. When the case is finally submitted to the jury, the structured dialogue of the courtroom gives way to silence. Deliberation begins in private, away from legal argument and procedural constraint. Inside the jury room, the evidence is reconsidered without formal guidance, relying on collective reasoning shaped by everything presented during the trial. The verdict, when delivered, represents not only a conclusion about guilt or innocence, but also a moment where investigative reconstruction is either affirmed or challenged by legal authority. It is the point at which the narrative constructed through investigation and prosecution is either accepted as sufficient or found lacking under the standards of law. For victims' families, the verdict does not resolve the emotional reality of loss, but it does provide a formal acknowledgement of responsibility, or the absence thereof. This distinction is important. Legal resolution and emotional resolution do not operate on the same timeline, and one does not automatically produce the other. For investigators, the conclusion of a trial marks the end of a structured process that began at the moment of discovery. The evidence collected, analyzed, and reconstructed over months or years is now translated into a legal outcome that will become part of official record. Yet even this closure is procedural rather than narrative. The human complexity of the case remains unchanged, even as its legal interpretation is finalized. In the broader context of Chicago's history of violent crime, each trial contributes to an evolving institutional understanding of how such cases are investigated and prosecuted. Lessons learned in one case inform approaches in others, refining methodology and reinforcing procedural standards. But each case also remains distinct, shaped by its own unique combination of circumstances. As we move beyond the courtroom, the focus will shift from legal resolution to aftermath, where the consequences of investigation and trial extend into personal lives, public memory, and cultural interpretation. Because even after a verdict is reached, the story of what happened does not simply end. It continues to exist in the spaces between official conclusion and human understanding. After the courtroom falls silent and the verdict becomes part of the official record, something less visible begins. It does not have the structure of investigation or the formality of trial. It is not guided by procedure or constrained by legal standards. It is slower, more fragmented, and often more difficult to define. This is the aftermath, where the consequences of a violent case continue to unfold long after the system has declared it resolved. In Chicago, as in any large city with a long history of homicide investigations, the aftermath does not belong to a single moment. It stretches across months, years, sometimes decades. For investigators, it may appear as case closure. For the courts, it is a completed process. But for everyone connected to the case in a personal way, the ending is not an ending at all. It is a shift in how the story continues to exist. For the families of victims, the aftermath begins when the structure of legal proceedings is removed and only absence remains. During the investigation and trial, there is at least a framework that gives shape to uncertainty. There are updates, procedures, scheduled hearings, and defined stages. Once that structure disappears, grief becomes uncontained again. It is no longer organized by dates or events. It becomes continuous. Many family members describe a strange dissonance in this period. The world around them resumes its normal rhythm, while their internal experience remains anchored to the moment everything changed. Streets are still busy. Conversations continue. Seasons shift. But the sense of interruption never fully resolves. Time moves forward externally while remaining partially suspended internally. In cases involving extreme violence and dismemberment, this emotional dissonance is often intensified by the nature of what was revealed during investigation and trial. The knowledge of how the body was found, how evidence was reconstructed, and how events unfolded cannot be unlearned. It becomes part of memory in a way that is both specific and unavoidable. Even when not actively recalled, it remains present as background awareness. For investigators, the aftermath takes a different form. Once a case is closed, it is archived within institutional memory. Reports are filed, evidence is stored, and procedural lessons are absorbed into training and future practice. There is a sense of completion at the administrative level, but not necessarily at the human level. Many investigators carry residual awareness of cases long after official involvement ends, especially those involving particularly complex or disturbing circumstances. This is not emotional detachment in the simplistic sense. It is a form of compartmentalization developed through repeated exposure to violent outcomes. The ability to transition from active investigation to closure is necessary for continued work, but it does not erase memory. Instead, it organizes it into a structured internal archive that can be accessed, but is not constantly present. In the broader city context, the aftermath of such cases is absorbed into public consciousness in uneven ways. Some cases fade quickly, replaced by newer events. Others linger, becoming part of informal narrative landscapes that circulate through media, conversation, and cultural interpretation. The degree to which a case persists in memory is not always proportional to its legal significance or investigative complexity. It is often influenced by the imagery associated with it, the circumstances of discovery, or the way it was initially reported. Cases involving dismemberment tend to persist longer in public memory due to their visceral impact. Even when details are clarified or corrected, the initial impression remains influential. This creates a layered memory structure, in which factual resolution and emotional perception coexist, without fully aligning. Official closure does not necessarily translate into narrative closure. Over time, these cases can become detached from their original context. They may be referenced in discussions about broader patterns of violence, even when no such patterns exist in investigative records. They may be grouped together based on superficial similarities, creating the impression of continuity where there is none. This process reflects how human cognition organizes complex information, particularly when faced with repeated exposure to traumatic subject matter. In Chicago specifically, the diversity of homicide cases contributes to this effect. The city's size, population density, and social complexity produce a wide range of violent outcomes that do not conform to a single explanatory framework. Yet in public interpretation, there is often a tendency to compress this diversity into simplified narratives. The aftermath of individual cases becomes part of a larger imagined structure, shaped more by perception than by evidence. For communities directly affected by violent crime, the aftermath is also a period of adaptation. Neighborhoods where incidents occurred do not remain frozen in the moment of discovery or investigation. Daily life continues, but it is often altered in subtle ways. Awareness of what happened persists in shared memory, influencing how spaces are experienced even after physical traces of the event have been removed. This does not always manifest as visible change. It can be as simple as altered perception of a location, a shift in how safety is understood, or a lingering sense of caution in places that once felt entirely ordinary. These changes are not uniform across all individuals, but they form part of the collective response to violence within a shared environment. In some cases, memorialization occurs. This may take formal forms, such as public acknowledgements or private commemorations, or informal forms, such as continued mention within families and social groups. These acts of remembrance serve different purposes. Some are focused on honoring the victim's life. Others are centered on processing loss. All of them contribute to how the aftermath is structured socially. At the institutional level, the aftermath also includes reflection and procedural refinement. Law enforcement agencies review cases to identify areas where investigative methods can be improved. This may involve updating forensic protocols, adjusting evidence handling procedures, or refining interview techniques. The goal is not to revisit the emotional content of the case, but to strengthen future investigative capacity. Legal institutions similarly incorporate lessons from completed trials into ongoing practice. Judicial reasoning, evidentiary standards, and procedural interpretations evolve gradually through accumulated case experience. Each resolved case becomes part of a larger legal framework that continues to develop over time. Despite these structured forms of aftermath, there remains an unstructured layer that resists integration. This is the personal memory of those indirectly connected to the case, witnesses who were not central to proceedings, first responders who encountered the scene briefly, community members who were aware of the event, but not directly involved. For these individuals, the case may exist as a moment that intermittently returns in memory without formal context. This layered persistence of memory creates a complex relationship between closure and continuity. Officially, the case is resolved. Procedurally, it is complete. But in lived experience, it continues to exist in fragmented forms across different levels of awareness. Over time, the intensity of aftermath typically diminishes, but it does not fully disappear. Instead, it integrates into broader patterns of memory and understanding. The case becomes part of a historical landscape rather than an immediate event. Its details may fade, but its presence remains embedded in how individuals and communities understand violence, vulnerability, and the limits of control. In the specific context of cases that were once grouped under informal labels like Dahlia-like Chicago dismemberment cases, the aftermath also involves a gradual correction of narrative distortion. Over time, the recognition that these cases were not part of a unified pattern becomes more widely understood in informed contexts. However, popular interpretation may continue to retain simplified versions of the story. This divergence between understanding and perception is a defining feature of aftermath in complex violent cases. It reflects the gap between structured knowledge and narrative memory, between investigative conclusion and cultural interpretation. As this series moves toward its conclusion, the focus in the final section will shift to reflection. Not on the events themselves, but on how they are remembered, interpreted, and ultimately absorbed into the ongoing relationship between truth, perception, and the human need to find structure, in what is often irreparably fragmented. After the aftermath settles into a slower rhythm, what remains is reflection. Not the reflective thinking of investigators, who must translate events into evidence, or of courts, which must convert evidence into judgment, but something more diffuse and uncertain. This is the reflection that occurs in culture, in memory, and in the long space after official narratives have already been fixed. It is where meaning continues to evolve even when facts no longer change. In Chicago's history of violent crime, reflection often begins where documentation ends. Once a case is closed, it leaves behind a residue that is no longer actively managed by institutions, but is still actively interpreted by the public. This interpretation does not follow a single direction. It branches into multiple versions of understanding, shaped by media framing, personal memory, and the human tendency to search for coherence in events that resist it. The phrase, Dahlia-like Chicago dismemberment cases, itself, is a product of this reflective space. It was never a formal category in investigative or legal systems. It emerged from attempts to describe, in simplified language, a set of unrelated cases that shared only superficial similarities. Yet once such a phrase enters circulation, it begins to shape perception in ways that extend beyond its original meaning. It becomes a lens through which new information is filtered, even when that information contradicts the premise of the lens itself. This is how reflection can distort as much as it clarifies. When multiple independent cases are grouped together under a shared label, the differences between them begin to fade in collective memory. Distinct timelines collapse into generalized impressions. Separate motivations are merged into a single imagined cause. The complexity of individual cases is gradually replaced by a simplified narrative structure that feels more understandable, even if it is less accurate. In Chicago, this process is amplified by the scale of the city and the volume of violent incidents over time. The human mind, when confronted with repeated exposure to similar categories of tragedy, tends to compress them. This compression is not intentional. It is a cognitive response to overload. But its effect is to create patterns that feel meaningful even when they are not supported by investigative continuity. The danger of this reflective compression is not only that it simplifies reality, but that it can generate false continuity. Cases that were entirely unrelated in origin, method, and circumstance begin to appear as if they belong to a hidden sequence. This perception can persist long after official clarification has established that no such sequence exists. Once formed, these impressions are resistant to correction because they are reinforced by narrative familiarity rather than factual structure. At the same time, reflection also serves an important function. It allows societies to process traumatic information over time, to integrate events that would otherwise remain psychologically overwhelming if encountered only in their immediate form. Without reflection, violent cases would exist only as isolated shocks. With reflection, they become part of a broader attempt to understand patterns of harm, vulnerability, and systemic conditions that contribute to violence. This dual nature of reflection, both clarifying and distorting, is especially visible in how dismemberment cases are discussed in broader cultural contexts. On one hand, there is an attempt to understand the forensic, psychological, and situational factors that lead to such outcomes. On the other hand, there is a tendency to elevate the most visually or emotionally striking aspects of those cases, often at the expense of nuance. The result is a layered memory structure, in which factual accuracy and symbolic interpretation coexist, without fully aligning. Investigative records remain precise, bounded, and case-specific. Cultural memory becomes more fluid, associative, and generalized. The gap between these two forms of understanding is where myths often emerge. It is within this gap that the idea of a hidden continuity between unrelated Chicago cases takes hold. Not because evidence supports it, but because reflection naturally seeks connection. The mind resists fragmentation. It prefers continuity, even when continuity is not present in the underlying reality. This preference becomes more pronounced when dealing with violent events, where the emotional impact encourages meaning-making beyond what is strictly supported by fact. Over time, reflection also alters the perceived relationship between individual cases and the city itself. Chicago becomes not just a location where events occurred, but a symbolic environment within which those events are interpreted. The city is assigned characteristics that reflect the nature of the cases being discussed, even though those characteristics are not uniformly representative of its actual complexity. This symbolic layering is not unique to Chicago. It occurs in many large cities with histories of high-profile violent crime. But in Chicago's case, the combination of scale, media attention, and historical continuity of reporting has made it particularly pronounced. Reflection does not simply preserve memory. It reshapes it. At the level of individual understanding, reflection often takes the form of repeated reconsideration. People return to cases they have encountered, mentally reorganizing details, questioning earlier assumptions, and integrating new information as it becomes available. This process can lead to deeper understanding over time, but it can also reinforce simplified narratives if those narratives are more emotionally accessible than complex ones. For those directly connected to cases, reflection is more constrained. It is anchored in specific memory rather than abstract interpretation. The facts of what occurred do not become symbolic in the same way. They remain tied to personal experience, which resists generalization. This creates a divide between personal reflection and public reflection, each operating under different rules of meaning. Institutionally, reflection takes the form of review and analysis. Law enforcement agencies and legal systems examine past cases to improve future practice. This type of reflection is structured, evidence-based, and focused on procedural improvement rather than narrative interpretation. It does not seek to create meaning beyond operational relevance. The tension between institutional reflection and cultural reflection is one of the defining features of how violent cases are remembered in urban environments. One seeks precision and closure. The other seeks continuity and meaning. Neither fully overrides the other, and both continue to evolve independently over time. In cases that have been informally grouped under labels like Dahlia-like Chicago dismemberment cases, reflection has gradually clarified one central point: that the perceived pattern is not supported by investigative continuity. The cases that contributed to this label were not connected by shared perpetrators, methods, or timelines. They were connected only by retrospective interpretation applied after the fact. This realization, however, does not eliminate the label from cultural circulation. Reflection does not move in a single direction. Even as understanding becomes more precise in some contexts, simplified narratives can persist in others. Memory does not update uniformly across all levels of society. As we approach the conclusion of this narrative arc, reflection becomes a way of stepping back from constructed patterns and returning to the underlying reality of fragmentation. Not fragmentation as mystery, but fragmentation as structure. Each case exists independently. Each outcome arises from its own conditions. The appearance of connection is a product of interpretation layered over separation. The final stage of this exploration will bring all of these threads together, not by unifying them into a single explanation, but by acknowledging the limits of unification itself. Because sometimes the most important understanding is recognizing where patterns end, and where reality remains irreducibly separate. In the final stage of this narrative, there is a natural expectation that everything will resolve into clarity. That patterns will finally become visible in their true form, that fragmented cases will somehow align into a single intelligible structure, and that the long accumulation of investigation, reflection, and cultural interpretation will produce a definitive answer. But the reality of Chicago's so-called Dahlia-like dismemberment cases resists that expectation entirely. What remains, after all the layers have been examined, is not unity, but separation, not convergence, but continued fragmentation that no narrative framework can fully absorb. Across decades of violent crime in Chicago, the cases that were later grouped under this informal label were never connected by investigative continuity. They were never part of a shared mechanism, a shared perpetrator, or even a shared behavioral evolution. They were isolated events, each emerging from its own conditions, each concluding within its own limited horizon of explanation. And yet, in cultural memory, they began to resemble one another through repetition of imagery rather than repetition of cause. It is this distinction between similarity of appearance and difference of origin that defines the entire misunderstanding surrounding the concept. When people speak about patterns in violence, they are often not referring to forensic patterns at all. They are referring to emotional patterns, narrative patterns, psychological patterns that arise in the act of remembering rather than in the act of investigation. A fragmented body, a concealed remains site, a case that involves post-mortem dismemberment, these elements carry an immediate visual and emotional weight that encourages grouping. The mind does not naturally separate them into isolated files. It collects them into categories that feel more manageable, even if those categories do not exist in reality. This is not a failure of logic. It is a feature of human cognition. Faced with overwhelming and morally disturbing information, the brain seeks compression. It reduces complexity in order to preserve comprehension. But in doing so, it introduces structures that were never present in the original events. The label Dahlia-like Chicago dismemberment cases is one such structure. It is not an investigative classification. It is a retrospective abstraction built from selective memory. What is often forgotten in this process is that each case contained its own internal logic at the moment it occurred. The circumstances that led to violence were specific, not general. The relationships involved, where they existed, were personal rather than archetypal. The environments were concrete, not symbolic. Even in cases where post-mortem concealment occurred, the reasons behind those actions were tied to immediate situational pressures rather than to any broader behavioral pattern that could extend across unrelated incidents. Investigators understand this separation intuitively. Their work depends on it. Every case must be treated as an independent structure, built from its own evidence, its own timeline, its own set of constraints. The temptation to connect cases based on surface similarity is something that must be actively resisted, because it can distort interpretation and lead to false assumptions about causality. In forensic practice, similarity is never sufficient to establish connection. Only verified linkage can do that. Yet outside the investigative framework, connection is often assumed rather than proven. This is especially true in media narratives, where the need for coherence can outweigh the complexity of accuracy. Stories are more easily communicated when they can be grouped into themes. And themes, once established, tend to persist even when later evidence contradicts them. The idea of a hidden continuity between unrelated Chicago cases is one such theme. It survives not because it is supported, but because it is narratively compelling. Over time, this creates a layered understanding of violence in which multiple versions of reality coexist. There is the investigative reality, grounded in evidence and constrained by verification. There is the legal reality, structured by admissibility and procedural outcome. And there is the cultural reality, shaped by memory, interpretation, and emotional resonance. These three layers do not always align, and when they diverge, it is the cultural layer that tends to dominate public imagination. This divergence becomes particularly visible in cases involving dismemberment, where the visceral nature of the evidence leaves a strong impression that is difficult to recalibrate once formed. Even when later clarification demonstrates that cases are unrelated, the initial emotional grouping often remains intact. This persistence is not irrational. It reflects the strength of first impression in human cognition. But it does mean that correction and understanding operate on different timelines. In Chicago, the accumulation of violent cases over decades has created a dense historical backdrop against which new incidents are constantly interpreted. This backdrop functions like a filter. Each new case is unconsciously compared to previous ones, and similarities are emphasized while differences are minimized. This is how the perception of pattern emerges without actual continuity. The pattern exists in interpretation, not in structure. When examined at the level of individual cases, however, the illusion of continuity dissolves. There is no shared trajectory that links the events together. No evolving methodology that progresses from one incident to the next. No singular investigative thread that spans decades. Instead, there are discrete points in time, each representing a separate rupture in separate lives, separated further by circumstance, geography, and intent. This fragmentation is not an anomaly. It is the default condition of urban violence. Large cities produce large numbers of independent events, each shaped by local conditions that do not generalize easily. The human mind, however, is not naturally comfortable with this level of discontinuity. It seeks to impose structure where none exists, because structure provides emotional stability in the face of randomness. The danger lies not in recognizing patterns, but in mistaking interpretive patterns for factual ones. When unrelated cases are grouped together under a shared narrative, the result is a distortion of both understanding and memory. The individual reality of each case is diminished in favor of a collective image that is easier to retain, but less accurate to the underlying truth. At the same time, it is important to acknowledge why this distortion occurs. Violence, particularly violence that involves fragmentation or concealment, resists simple comprehension. It disrupts normal categories of understanding. In response, the mind constructs bridges between events that feel similar, even when those bridges are not supported by evidence. This is not a flaw in reasoning, but a response to emotional and cognitive overload. What emerges from this process is a tension between truth and narrative. Truth, in the investigative sense, is specific, bounded, and case-dependent. Narrative, in the cultural sense, is fluid, expansive, and pattern-seeking. The two are not inherently in conflict, but they operate under different principles. One prioritizes accuracy. The other prioritizes coherence. In the case of the so-called Chicago dismemberment cases, this tension has produced a long-standing misalignment between perception and reality. The perception suggests continuity, hidden structure, and thematic repetition. The reality shows separation, independence, and situational specificity. Both exist simultaneously, but only one is supported by evidence. As this exploration concludes, it becomes clear that the most important insight is not about violence itself, but about how violence is interpreted over time. The events do not change once they are completed. What changes is the framework through which they are understood. Investigation narrows meaning. Law formalizes it. Culture expands it again, often beyond the boundaries of what was originally established. The final understanding, then, is not a unification of cases into a single explanation, but an acceptance of their irreducible separation. Each case stands alone, not as part of a hidden sequence, but as an individual rupture with its own origin and its own end. The appearance of connection is a product of reflection, not of structure. And in recognizing this, the narrative does not become simpler. It becomes more accurate. Because the absence of pattern is itself a form of understanding, one that requires letting go of the need for continuity where none exists.